Ramon Perez, thank you so much for making time for our show.
Oh, I appreciate being here. Thank you, David.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the democracy, the Digital Democracy Project. And I know there might be a little confusion because there's another project in California with the same name. So tell us a little bit about the Florida project and where it's at.
Right. So, Digital Democracy Project, the basic idea is we're using mobile voting software, which has been used for binding elections for military voters overseas to cast a ballot from their phone when they're deployed in austere environments. Except that we're using the software not to host a regular election. We're a nonprofit organization. We're using the software to let people vote on bills as they're being debated in Congress and provide your inputs directly to your legislator so that they know what their districts want in the lead up to a vote on the floor in the chambers. But we also, after the session is over, we compare what do the voters want in the mobile voting app to what did the legislators actually do on the floor in Congress. And we provide every legislator a scorecard, which is very much like a baseball card, which shows how often are they doing what their districts are asking them to do.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds pretty interesting, and I think we often struggle with accountability, for our legislators. And I saw a poll today or I saw a little headline today about that Congress was recently given a 10% approval rating, which is about the same as North Korea for Americans.
Yes. No, it's pretty awful. I mean, if you look at all the structural deficiencies in our current system of government that have put us in the position where we've got this, as you define, like the outrage machine, the hyper partisanship, the constant bickering and backbiting, the inability to get anything done. Yeah, it's no surprise if people are feeling dejected or checked out or angry at Congress as a concept, and yet individual congressmen have a 92% reelection rate. I mean, you basically have to die or retire, or in the case of Eric Swalwell, more or less get forced out by some major scandal to remove somebody from office. I mean, once you're in for life. I mean, it's a pretty awful system of incentives, and that's why we find ourselves where we are.
Yeah, it's like there's an old joke about that like all of Congress is bad, but my representative is fine.
Exactly. Exactly. People like the individual politician if they get a chance to talk to them or interact with them. The issue is that those politicians are not accountable to the voters in the way we would want them to be. They're mostly accountable to the people who vote in primary elections, which is 8 to 10% of the actual voting electorate, because the districts have been so heavily gerrymandered that they don't, by the time November rolls around, 94% of US House seats are completely uncompetitive in a general election, meaning that they're not within a 5 percentage point margin of victory. So the real election is the one that takes place in the primaries, and congressmen know who they need to talk to win within their party and to stave off of uh, a primary from either their right in the case of the Republicans or a primary from the left in the case of the Democrats. That's why they don't really feel accountable to everybody else.
Yeah, and that's been a big that's a big part of how we are where we are now, and the degree to which that's changed over the last few decades. Um, you said just a little while ago about sort of this idea that people are sort of dejected or are cynical, and I hear that from people all the time, um, where we sort of feel like we're sort of left with this choice between a despot or some kind of anarchy, right? Um,
Right.
and tell us a little bit about why, from a systems perspective, that assumption is flawed, and what is this third path?
Right, exactly. I think that people are looking for results. And if democracy can't deliver results, they will look to anarchy or despotism because, they'll see those as the way out of the doldrums that we find ourselves in. We have to convince people that democracy can deliver. And I happen to think that the best way to do that is to use the pretty incredible technologies that we find ourselves with to disrupt a system that is very much antiquated, has lots and layers of middle management. You've got loads of people standing between us and our representative. You've got special interests and lobbying groups and billionaire donor class. Obviously, the political parties themselves and their particular interests. So we already talked about primaries and drawing maps to make everything uncompetitive. So there's so many things that stand between us and our representative. And if we look at, you live in San Francisco, if you look at one of the things that technology has always done incredibly well, it's cutting out middlemen. It's reconnecting, buyer and seller, or it's reconnecting. Let's talk about Airbnb. Somebody who has a spare bedroom and somebody who needs a place to sleep, and carving out a lot of those middle layers is what the internet is the basics of what it can do incredibly well. And yet we haven't seen that kind of disruption in the political system, mostly because the people who write the laws for our elections are the exact same people who run for election under those laws. It'd be like if you let the New England Patriots determine how to officiate an NFL game. I mean, everybody be deflating balls and stealing signals. I mean, it's a terrible conflict of interest. So you have to find ways around those structural inefficiencies, and I think technology is how we do it.
Yeah, maybe. I guess I'm a technocrat in my entire career, I guess, in many ways, but I'm a little bit more cynical now as I've learned more about some of the other aspects of the landscape we're in. Um,
Well, do you want to dig into that? Because I think obviously your experience is pretty valuable in forming that statement. Here's what I would suggest is that the reason I think mobile voting is a differentiator here is because if you can let a military voter on a submarine under the ocean or deployed in the Horn of Africa open up a phone and have a secure mechanism to cast a ballot where it verifies their photo ID, finds them on the voter file, makes sure they're a US citizen, a resident of a given district, puts a vote token on a blockchain, and uses homomorphic encryption and two-factor authentication and biometrics and all that kind of thing to make sure that the vote that's counted is the vote that's cast. If you can do that for a small subset of military members, then why couldn't you let people participate in the process more than once every couple of years for an election? Why couldn't you create the Netflix of government, create government on demand? The technology allows a level of secure participation that we had never had before. And I think that's one of the important differentiators in this particular case. I completely understand how things can go awry. Part of the reason why we formed ourselves as a nonprofit organization and we're explicit about having people of different parties affiliation on our board of directors is to make sure that it becomes a corporate governance, a responsible use in the way that we're structured as an organization so that this very powerful technology does not get twisted and used for the purpose of consuming people's data, selling them advertising, generating an outrage machine, all the things that we've seen go wrong in Silicon Valley, if we're being quite honest. So we as an organization, we need to learn how to move fast and fix things at the same speed that others have figured out how to move fast and break them.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because it wasn't clear there that, yeah, I'm comfortable with the technology, and I wasn't going to go super deep into the biometrics and all that. But my audience knows I have some tech background, and I would say that I'm pretty comfortable with the technology side of it. And I'm glad you bring up those other points because, yeah, my cynicism often comes from having, been for quite a while involved in sort of the Silicon Valley investment world and watching that evolve over the last, 20 or 30 years and seeing some of the new direction that that's gone in. And yeah, you bring up some big points about, yes, what I'm really talking about is sort of some of these structural behind the scenes type things, right? That, just this model of how it starts to become, how to extract money from people and these kinds of things, and how power can get centralized into a very small number of hands. And yeah, so a lot of it is the kind of things you're talking about, how you've structured this, how to have public accountability to it. I mean, that's what's missing in a lot of the technologies that are kind of destroying our society, right? There is no public accountability and no public good aspect to them. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that is a key piece of this type of work and the way you're doing it. That has to stay there. Like that can't suddenly be taken over by an Elon Musk or a Peter Thiel or something.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I think we think of this as a public good and we've structured it that way. This is truly a community project. We've been intentional about the fact that we as a nonprofit organization, we're using the Votes mobile software and they are a commercial business, But in that sense, we cannot see as someone's secret ballot. It's your choice about whether or not you support the Iran War Powers Resolution, for example, a bill that we carried recently, or the DHS funding bill. That is your private insight. We have no mechanism for seeing that, which of course means we can't leverage that to try to generate ad revenue or something to that based on your preference for whatever policies. So that's been intentional, and we would only do that because we're a nonprofit. A for-profit would never give up that kind of data.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. That's one place I wanted to go next is the funding, right? So, this received bipartisan funding in Florida in theory, but then it was vetoed by that bipartisan bill was that appropriation was ultimately vetoed by Governor DeSantis, if I understand correctly. Right. And so, I kind of hate these three-part questions, but I was going to ask, A, what's the status now? And did losing that backing fundamentally change, your model or your strategy, or, how are you going to move? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, that was a real gut punch because obviously we spent a ton of time and energy working with, had some great Republican and Democrat servant leaders who just saw the value in what we were doing, didn't see it as inherently a partisan concept at all. I mean, if you're in a ruby red district in the Florida Panhandle, you're not worried necessarily about hearing from your voters. They're conservatives. You're not worried about that. So generally speaking, those guys cared about being on the wrong side of a party split. They were actually caught in the middle of a DeSantis-Trump process at the time, and wanting to know where to stand on certain issues within the party was actually the value that they saw in being able to use this technology to hear from their districts. Perhaps the most intense example of that might have been the Epstein files at a federal level, but there are state equivalents as well. So we got a senior Republican out of Ocala, a guy named Keith Perry, great guy, saw immediately the value in it. A junior Democrat named Rita Harris out of Orlando, and they worked together to get us an appropriation, pushed it all the way through a lengthy budget process. And then, for unknown reasons, the governor went after it. Let's be honest, it's because these scorecards that we produce provide that sense of accountability, because we are matching what people are asking for in the app to the direct votes taken by legislators on the floor, and that does make some legislators look bad. And so we know why we got vetoed. But the upshot of that, I suppose, is that it forced us to change our strategy and actually go outside of Florida and look at expanding to other states, and we have done that. So now voters in all 50 states, if you're on the voter file in your state, you can vote on federal legislation on what's happening in Congress. So we have now have worked through a lot of the technical challenges to allow us to support federal bills for all 50 states. And we've expanded for state level legislation to an additional 6 states. So that's Arizona, Utah, Washington, Virginia, Michigan, Massachusetts. And our ambition is to be in all 50 states so that, California voters could vote on California legislation by 2027. So we're still trying to aggressively expand, and we've done it through raising money from large checks written by individual donors, as well as a bunch of small dollar donations that come through our website. And I think actually I'm pretty proud to see how our community of volunteers and small donors have kind of rallied around us, because we originally thought the path to success was you build the thing and then you get the state to take it over. It should be the supervisor of elections running this project, not us. Like, we're a nonprofit organization. And yet, for political reasons, that didn't happen. But as a result, now we're really trying to build a community, a grassroots approach that perhaps will be more robust in the long term.
Yeah. So you it sounds like was my follow-up question, which was, it sounds like you are optimistic about doing this without government funding.
Absolutely. I am. I think perhaps even more so because it means that, it's challenging, but some of the things that really benefited us that we could never have anticipated is the explosive growth of AI. When we started this project, we were beta testing in early 2022. ChatGPT didn't exist yet. Now we're at, and I had to hire a Democrat and a Republican who had Tallahassee experience, who were legislative aides for different representatives, to work together to read and summarize all these bills. And these are large bills, hundreds of pages potentially, and come to a nonpartisan, factually accurate consensus on what the bill does so that we could make that clear to voters when they're making up their mind. Well, what AI has given us is the ability to rapidly expand the number of bills that we can review. And now our legislative team can review what the outputs of that, make sure it makes sense, make sure there's no hallucinations, send it back for review or make edits where needed. But it greatly increased our ability to carry more bills, and as such allows us to expand to other states and federal. So that's been a game changer for us in our in what we can do and how we can expand. Even as an all volunteer team, the money that we bring in, we spend on technology. A lot of now is we're generating code using Claude Code, and we're now accelerating our product pipeline, adding new features. We just put a chatbot on our website that lets you ask detailed questions about legislation right on, because we load hundreds of thousands of pages of legislative text into a vector database and serve that up as a knowledge base for what we call VoteBot. So when you go and ask VoteBot questions, it can rapidly find what's the latest status of this bill, how has it been voted on, give me detailed understanding of how it affects this policy or that. Because what we had found also was that the biggest barrier to entry for a lot of people is this information asymmetry. They don't understand the legislation because legislation is written by lawyers for other lawyers or for some judge someday or some Supreme Court hearings, whatever. It's not written for any of us. So being able to translate from complex legalese into plain speak has been enormously valuable in helping us educate voters and get people to engage, lower the barrier to entry for people to participate.
It's funny because that was literally like the next question in my notes to ask. But I want to really stress how big of a deal that is because not only the summarization and making it in plain language, but also the thing you were talking about how that status, getting the status on a bill can be hard. Like that can be written in weird ways. I can't figure out, like there's been 15 levels of things it's been through. Like where is it? I don't know where it is. Even summarizing that is huge.
Yes. So, or 1,000-page omnibus where the line item of funding cuts that you care about is buried in some subsection 243 paragraph A. Yet now we can do that. I mean, that is what makes it pretty incredible. We've had legislative policy analysts come to us and say, this is an incredibly useful tool and we're making it free on our website. Like, these things that normally they would have paid a lot of money, or you'd have to find some subject matter expert to spend days pulling apart a piece of legislation, now can be done instantaneously. It is really remarkable what that is giving us in terms of that lowering that challenge for people to even understand what their representatives are doing on their behalf.
Well, and I'm kind of wondering with that, that seems like it's a pretty big threat to, you talked about, we've talked a lot, we hear this a lot of times that, these basically lobbyists write the laws and the legislators kind of just pass it through.
Yes.
And they write those laws in such a way that they're the only ones that really understand it. I would think that would be a threat to that establishment class. And so I'm curious, like, how does that play into all this?
Again, because I guess you could say because we're not taking money from the state of Florida, we don't have to worry about those people. I mean, like, the nice thing about being a completely community grassroots organization is that we're beholden to the voters. We're not beholden to the lobbyists or established or even the two parties. I mean, that's not our mission. Our mission is to educate voters and give them a say in a process that is more transparent, because right now their issue is they're like, oh yeah, I can email my congressman, but I have no idea. He could suppress all that information. If 99 out of 100 say don't vote on this war powers resolution, and yet whether it's the president putting pressure on them or whether it's some lobbyist telling them how to vote, they can suppress all the 99 out of 100 and they can vote how they want. Our goal is to make it entirely transparent. It's why we put the votes on a blockchain. It's why we put all the maps on our website. It's why we provide real-time updates or hourly updates about how in an aggregate way what voters want on each of these bills, because we want the press to see it. We want journalists to write stories about it. We want legislators to feel pressured that their districts are telling them they want a thing, and they feel pressured to deliver the thing. So yes, I would say it is our intention to go around the existing structures that exist, because voters have been carved out of that process by that structure. That structure has been put into place intentionally to not listen to the voters that people don't want to hear from. And now we have to reconnect those folks. And mind you, I will say, in a bipartisan way, California uses gerrymandering as a weapon of voter suppression, just like Florida does. Okay, so I live in Florida, you live in California, but the tools are the same for carving out voters that the politicians don't want to hear from.
Well, yeah, they don't have to be transparent with when we write to them either, like you're saying either. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but so I spent a bit of my career, working with founders, kind of trying to break in with new technologies and things like that, right? A lot of disruptors or would be disruptors, and and I always had a conversation with them about you kind of know who your friends are and who your enemies are. And in other words, who else wins if I do this? Who wins if I do this, and who loses if I do this? And
Mm-hmm.
if you have a really big, powerful enemy that loses when you do this, is there any, how is there some structural element and that makes you resilient to that? Like, can you
Mm-hmm.
survive if a Google hates you? How are you going to survive Google? They have a lot of power, that kind of thing. Have you had any of those kind of wargaming exercises?
Um, I think that the power of the public has to be what we're driven by. And I absolutely understand there are going to be winners and losers in this scenario, because the politics industry is an industry. People don't really think of it in those terms. When people think about democracy, they think about candidates and campaigns and stuff. But I've spent a fair amount of time on the inside of that, either running within campaigns, being a state nominee to states delegations, these kinds of things, like being inside the party apparatus. So I don't dispute the fact that there are a lot of people who make their money off of the political machinery, and would feel threatened by this. But I do think that there are enough people within that system, and we've got the names of many servant leaders on our website who have endorsed our project and said, I actually, as a state representative, a sitting legislator, or as a candidate, want to use this technology to hear from my voters. So I think you're right in the sense that, yes, there will be people who feel threatened, but there are just as many people who feel empowered. And a lot of them are legislators who got their job thinking that they wanted to be Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and arrived realizing that they walked into a system of terrible incentives, and they have to decide whether to go along and get along, or keep some sense of principle and actually be accountable to their voters. And so we are trying to find the latter and avoid the former. And I think that's where that's our strategy for the most part, is find legislators who already agree that the system is broken, because they live it every day, and they are the ones who can carry us forward.
And I think you make a good point there too. That we're very cynical. I mean, the 10% approval rating. We're very cynical
Mm-hmm.
about Congress, right? But the reality is, many of those folks did go in for the exact reason you're talking about. Like, they really do want to help their constituents, and then, like you say, they get there, and their first orientation is sort of how many phone calls they're going to have to make to raise money, and
Bingo. I mean, a junior congressman in Washington spends 70 to 80% of their time dialing for dollars. And it happens at the state level too. The first, actually, the couple of the first people who endorsed us were Republicans, who then got immediately smacked down by the House leadership. And then we had some Democrats endorse us, who, one actually, Commander Tom Keene, who I talk about in my TED Talk, but he was not the party favorite. He actually unseated the party favorite in that primary contest, because he was willing to use this technology to hear from voters in a new and interesting way. And that resonated with people. So I happen to think that there's a competitive advantage to doing what voters want you to do. And sometimes that's going to
imagine
upset.
that.
I know. People are looking for an alternative. So, because right now the alternative is to just check out. Everybody just is like, I can't deal with it anymore. It's been the constant anger. I can't talk to my family at Thanksgiving anymore. It's hard to even people I work with. I don't know where they stand. It's just you're constantly walking around on eggshells with people because of the political environment, and so people just check out. They won't even watch the news. It's rough. So we want to try to give people a reason to believe again, and to get involved in, and also to come to the realization that no politician is going to save us. It really is up to us to save ourselves. This democracy belongs to us. It always has, even though it doesn't always look that way. It still belongs to us. And it is our responsibility to build the next version of this system of government that's going to last the next 250 years.
Yeah, they wouldn't spend as much money as they do trying to get us to vote a certain way if our vote didn't matter, as we often say, right?
Exactly, exactly. And unfortunately, for a lot of voters in a lot of districts, they are stuck. We always talk about a two-party system, but the reality of gerrymandering is that most people live in a one-party system because they live in the 94% of U.S. House districts that are completely uncompetitive. They live in the 80% of U.S. states at this point where one party controls all three branches, right? And I'm talking about not only just the two sides of the legislature and the governor's office, like in California, but also the state Supreme Courts, which is the case in Florida. So you basically have millions of people who live in states where, effectively speaking, they're in a one-party state. I mean, that's the situation we find ourselves in. And it's going to be up to all of us to design a new version of American democracy using the tools that we have available to, in my mind, go around the systems that have been put in between us and our representatives.
Yeah, and another little note there for us, because I think a big piece of this, I want to dive into this next, is breaking some of these misperceptions that we have out there. So I want to dive into that a little bit. But one of those misperceptions a little bit too is even in those cases where one party sort of controls all these houses in a state, and they then take that as a mandate, but many times they hold that by a small majority in each group. So it's like a 1 or 2% majority maybe, or something pretty small, but then they treat it as just this mandate. Now you want, we're just going to dominate every policy. So we have to remember that even in a quote unquote blue or a very red state, often those majorities are much less than sort of the perceptions are.
That's spot on. I mean, look, my dad is a lifelong Republican, and I often point out to him that there are more Republicans in California than there are in Florida. He thinks of himself as living in a red state. And I'm listening, the Republicans in California outnumber the Republicans in Florida, but the Republicans in California have 8 Republican members of the California delegation to Congress. The Republicans in Florida have 20 representatives in Congress. They're about to have 24 after this new round of gerrymandering that we just saw. The maps just got approved yesterday. In California, they're going to lose Republican seats because of the gerrymandering there. I also, I spend half my time in Virginia. Virginia just went through another round of gerrymandering where it's going to go from what was essentially a bipartisan, like purple state where you had, I think, 6 and 5, 5, 6. Now it's going to be 10-1 Democrats to Republicans. You don't do that by suddenly making those voters disappear. You do that by trying to spread you spread the peanut butter really thin on the bread, right? And there's a way that you can screw that up so that those small majorities go against you, and then you actually end up losing a ton of the seats that you thought you were going to win. I honestly think that could happen in Florida in 2026, but it just as likely could happen in Virginia and in California and everywhere. Gerrymandering is a double-edged sword, and if you do it a little bit too much, it comes back to bite you because voters get pissed off at that. Voters consistently across partisan divide hate when you rig the system to carve them out of the process.
And they should.
They should. They absolutely should. They also hate corruption. One of the most bipartisan popular bills we carried was the Stop Insider Trading Act. So there are areas of consensus. This whole concept of like a left and right dichotomy is an artificial construct.
Right.
We talk about things in left-right terms because we have a two-party system. If we had a 5-party system, we would talk about things in, the journalists would talk about it in 5 different political points of view, right? Because we have a 2-party system, we frame everything that way, but that's not how people think. That's not how people live their lives. So they hold what we might think is mutually exclusive ideas in their minds at any given time. And it's incumbent on us and our project to give people the avenue to express themselves on these policies the way that makes sense for them, regardless of partisanship or ideology.
Right. And if I understand it, this data is also available publicly, right? So anyone can
Mm-hmm.
go in. And because another misperception we have, and we spent a lot of time sort of on the psychological dynamics of the tribal nature of these red and blue segments and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
everyone lives in a, not everyone, but most of us live in some kind of a bubble, and a lot of people live in a pretty entrenched bubble where they think the policies that they support are really popular because they seem really popular
Mm-hmm.
because everyone in their bubble supports them, right?
Right,
And
right,
with a tool like this, you can see how popular something actually is. It
right.
also gives you an opportunity to kind of step out of your bubble a little bit and go, oh, I guess I am in a little bit of a fringe position on this thing. And why is that? Like, maybe why does everybody else see it this other way? Maybe I think
Exactly.
breaking down some of that can also help.
I think you're spot on. And the other thing too is that the information we're getting is algorithmically driven through social media feeds. So that bubble gets, yeah, you find yourself in that information bubble quite quickly with just a couple of clicks, right? And one of the things that actually I find incredibly useful about what AI is giving us is the ability to just ask people, look at the plain text of this bill, what's written in black or white. Don't worry about the media reporting about it, or who was the person who sponsored it, what party did they come from, what are the dynamics that actually led them to draft this bill in the first place. But look at the actual black and white and decide if you think it makes sense based on your understanding of the legislative text. Because what you find is that um, people actually moderate their opinions quite quickly when presented with the actual text. They're like, oh, I didn't realize the bill did that or didn't do that, because they're hearing some version. It's like playing that telephone game. They're hearing a version of a version of a version. Some journalist wrote something about it, right? That filters quite drastically because most bills won't even get covered, right? Some journalist wrote something about it. Then it got shared on social media and liked and reshared and liked and reshared and liked and reshared. By the time it got to them, the opinion about that legislation is wildly different from what the bill actually says. And I encounter this all the time with people who come from very progressive or very conservative. It doesn't really matter. They come to a piece of legislation and they all will reach out to us and be like, I did not even know, for one, 80% of the bills that you guys have covered, I hadn't even heard about because they get zero media attention. And then the ones that I have heard about, there's so much misreporting on them that it's nice to actually see the truth. What's the actual bill do? So yes, a lot of our mandate is really just in voter education. Besides the ability to give people some sense of transparency and accountability.
Yeah, and we know, there's been a lot of work in this that, when people are exposed to a reasonable, representation of issues, they aren't that, polarized, toxic kind of thing, because
Mm-hmm.
this nuance starts to come out and the real trade-offs start to get exposed, and then their actual rational brain can kind of kick in and go, well, I'm not comfortable with that trade-off, but I guess I could live with this. And we never ask that question, right? Because, like you say, by the time it gets
Mm-hmm.
to us, we've got this very heated version of it being presented to us. And this interview is going a lot longer than I thought, but hopefully I can stay in your window, because I'm really excited about this, actually more than I expected to be honest with you. Um, I think a real disruption here that is something that you mentioned early on. I want to make express stress for listeners a little bit, is this idea to also weigh not only in elections but in all this pending legislation too. So
Mm-hmm.
this gives us an opportunity to participate in the process between our every 2 years or whatever voting. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and actually, you hit on something I think that's very important, which is where I'm seeing the future of this technology is that establishing and understanding the trade-offs themselves. What is the framing of the debate? By the time a piece of legislation gets to us for an up or down vote on a House floor, like the debate's been baked in, right? The trade-offs have been decided by lots of factors well before we even see it. What we would love to do is get people further upstream of that and let people have a a conversation with AI and talk about the bill and perhaps even come to some crowdsourced consensus on what would be a way to make a bill better, how to amend it, how to make it better that broadly captures what people want across a political spectrum. So I'm pretty excited about some of the work being done by the Computational Democracy Center in the system called Polis. Polis used for like large crowdsourced inputs. I would really love to marry that with like language models on the front end and let people have a natural conversation that gets captured on Polis in the back end, and then do some sense making. There are some great tools that Google produces called a Jigsaw. There are other tools out there where you can do some sense making to kind of try to figure out, we've had all these conversations with all these people. We've sort of captured their thoughts. How does that actually then turn into a proposed change to a bill? Or what if you could even just draft the legislation from scratch, from millions of independent conversations about what people want? Like, to me, that's the dream scenario, is a true, completely digitized, like citizen assembly at scale type of program where you could get that level of crowdsourced knowledge baked into writing laws in a large way. I mean, I think there's so much that we can do to truly reimagine our process of democracy, and we're really just at the starting gun right now.
Yeah, interesting. I guess that's a good lead into, some of the. I want to speak for some of the technocrat critics, right? The using tools like that, using AI in those ways, and even having a data-driven scorecard. We could definitely call that kind of technocratic moves, right? And I've seen critics talk about they're critical of things that are primarily defined by metrics, and they talk about we're sort of missing the sort of moral, the human complexity, and that those kind of metrics can't capture that. So I'm curious to just hear your response to that concern.
Right. I think exactly. Well, sort of extending off of what I was saying is that the immediate thing is that, okay, trade-offs are complex, right? We sort of rely on our legislators to go to Congress on our behalf, or to go to Sacramento on our behalf, and deal with those trade-offs and come to through a system of debate and dialogue and consensus making, create some policy that deals with those trade-offs. The problem at this point is that system of debate and dialogue is broken, and therefore you cannot resolve trade-offs in a consensus making process. So we have to just acknowledge that the system that we thought would do that for us is no longer capable. And so what would a new system look like? And you're right in the sense that if where we currently stand right now is we say, okay, people in the app wanted X, legislators did Y, therefore legislator gets a thumbs down, and you get scored basically on how many thumbs ups and thumbs down. I mean, it's quite we try to make it super duper simple. But realistically, that does not acknowledge all of the potential trade-offs in there. A legislator might have voted no on this bill in order to get to a yes on that bill. And that is lost in that vote. They may have traded away their vote one way in an amendment or in a hearing or in allowing something in a procedural manner. We don't capture any of that right now. We capture straight up or down floor votes, right? So there's so much in the dialogue and debate consensus making process that we're not currently capturing in very simplified metrics that we currently provide. So that's exactly to your point, why I do think you want a system that allows a greater level of nuance. You might say, okay, I want to fund the schools. Okay, great. Everybody wants to fund the schools, but like, how do you fund the schools? Are you going to increase taxes? Are you going to cut spending somewhere else? You're going to have to get to the point where that trade-off is clear and obvious and evident to the person making the decision. And we're not there yet. What we would love to be, imagine a future, right, where you could essentially vote on a bill in Congress and have an immediate understanding of how much that would cost you in tax increases out of your very own paycheck at the end of the month, right? Like, that's when we're talking about an actual trade-off. You want to do X thing? Okay, it's going to be 30 cents more out of your paycheck every month, right? You're good with that? Okay, then you'll vote. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like that's the level of feedback loop that we need to get to. But you're talking, we're talking sometime in the future.
Well, you mentioned the word future, so I know we're kind of pushing against the clock here. So let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, I think I've heard you talk about how our American democracy, has been able to evolve under pressure before. I think you used something like coal being squeezed into a diamond. Um, and given the friction that you've faced, with this project so far, but it sounds like you've overcome that as well with by going more grassroots. Um, but where do you see some of the most compelling evidence that this political pressure is going to squeeze the current crisis into the next better evolution that you're talking about?
Yeah, I talk about that. If you look at the evolution of American democracy, it's usually only happened under intense pressure, where it's become quite obvious that the system is not meeting the need of the moment, right? I mean, the revolution only exists because for that reason, because an enormous amount of taxation raised during the French and Indian War led to this rebellion not having any representation over how those taxes were being raised and spent. And for the initial period of the Republic, you had to be wealthy, white, landowning, and male to have any representation. There was a series of rebellions internally that, as a result of that, that that sort of led to the increasingly popularization of what we now call universal manhood suffrage, where regardless of your wealth, you had the right to vote, right? But that wasn't a given. People had to fight for that. I fought, and bloodily so. Like a lot of people lost their lives trying to get there. The same thing with the Civil War, the deadliest war in American history, with 600,000 Americans killed on the basis of what we define as humanity and what we define as freedom. And for who does that apply? And the same thing with women's rights and with the Voting Rights Act. And I think that in every one of those cases, we came out with a better system of government that is more accessible by everybody, which has greater participation, and which ultimately led us into a better, happier, healthier, growing economy, growing middle class, a better society overall. And now we're finding we feel like we're stagnating. And I think everybody feels that. I mean, I don't care. I talk to just as many, MAGA Republicans and Wall Street type old school GOP folks I interact with. I talk to people on the way progressive left and the sort of centrists, the libertarians, the Greens, like everybody. I interact with a lot of people through this project. Nobody's happy right now. That is the consensus, is that we've been told, like, you just do this and your side will win and the other side will cry and you're going to feel good about yourself. And guess what? Nobody feels good about themselves right now. So I think we're at the point where we've been at this for several election cycles. We realize it's not getting better. The pressure is building. Everybody's angry about not getting the results they thought they were going to get. And now there's a chance to look upon this and reflect that, you know what, maybe it's a systemic and structural reason why everybody's pissed off right now. And we need to go at the actual structure, not the characters, not the personalities, not the individual politicians, not even the parties themselves, but the actual structure of how we as a society get together, debate and decide, and ultimately determine our own future.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah. It's not like you're passionate about this or anything.
I'm also 4 cups of coffee in there, David. So, I'm on the East Coast. I'm a few hours ahead of you.
Well, Ramon, tell us about how can people get involved? How can people find out, learn more? Tell us about how can I apply this to my life?
Look, we're a grassroots organization. We need voters to participate by voting in the app on bills that are being debated in Congress. You can go to digitaldemocracyproject.org. You can see how to download the Votes app, which is our partner, who's been amazing. I would love for them to be on your show because the technology itself is super cool. Download the Votes app, vote on bills. We put them in there. You see new ones every week, basically. You can vote. You can volunteer. We need developers. This isn't like open source. code base. We need help because it's an all volunteer team. When we're pushing features, it's volunteer developers helping us this. You've got a great audience in San Francisco of very smart developers who I think can help us accelerate. So we need volunteer time. We need donations, small dollar donations on our website. And we need to help spread the word. Find legislators who you think could be good servant leaders and see if they'll endorse the project. And we'll get them on our website, and we'll identify their campaigns as being saying that they want to hear from voters in this new and interesting way. So we need all the things. Any way that your audience feels like they can help, believe me, we need that help, because this is a community of citizens trying to save this republic.
Awesome. That's great. Say the website one more time.
digitaldemocracyproject.org.
Awesome. Well, Ramon Perez, thank you so much for making time for our program. I feel like we need to follow up here pretty soon and see, and maybe some other things. I think this is really, really some good work that our audience will be really interested in. So thanks again.
Well, I appreciate you having me, David. And definitely once we've got California state legislation, you and I can jump back on and we can talk about what's going on in Sacramento.
There you go. Perfect. All right. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate and enjoy speaking with you.
Thanks for having me on.